I started 2 weeks ago what I call the development of cotton from the old world to Alabama. And these slides came from a collection of slides that I found when I came to Auburn in 1984. They were in my office that I inherited. And over the years, a lot of friends and colleagues like Dr. Smith and others have given me old slides or shared with me pictures, and I've digitized these. And eventually, probably in the late 90s, I realized that in all these old pictures, there's a story here. It's a story about the history of Alabama agriculture. And that history of Alabama agriculture really is a history of cotton production in the state. So I started playing with these slides, and of course, you know, before the Civil War, there were no photographs. But I found some photographs that looked like they could have been taken before the Civil War. And the last time we met here 2 weeks ago, I gave you part one, which was the antebellum era in Alabama agriculture. We saw a lot of pictures, and we talked about, well, we talked about that incredibly phenomenal growth of cotton production from the time Alabama became a state. In fact, you recall that in 1817, the first shipload of cotton sailed out of Mobile to Europe. And that really got it started. The Industrial Revolution in Europe was underway. There was a huge demand for this upland cotton. We finally had a cotton gin that could gin it. We had the rivers in Alabama that could get it to the market, and cotton production took off. Now this is U.S. cotton production, but Alabama cotton production looked exactly the same way, the same type figure. And we talked about this up to the Civil War 2 weeks ago. Last week, Rod filled in with a lot more detail about the role of slavery in this entire era of cotton production, and how it just went hand in hand with cotton. Without the slavery, we would not have had this cotton production. Without slavery, the history of the United States would have been totally different. I don't know if it would have been better or worse, but it would have been different. We know that. So the slave issue in the southern states grew the same way as that cotton production grew. We ended 2 weeks ago with this graph of cotton production in 1860. And you can see that Alabama was at the very center of cotton production in the United States. Mississippi Delta was bigger, but Alabama was at the center of it. And that's when Alabama got the name the Cotton State. Of course, that's not necessarily the case today. We still grow a lot of cotton, but we're not the center of cotton production anymore. But in 1860, this was not only the center of cotton production in the United States, it was the center of cotton production in the world. Nowhere else in the world was cotton as concentrated as it was here in central Alabama and the Mississippi Delta. And then we ended with the Civil War. I want to kind of give you a preview of the slides that I'm going to share with you today. Several years ago, I took these same pictures and I added music to it. I'm real proud of my music. I know this music might interfere sometime with my talking, so in some cases, I'm just going to let the music play. And this kind of tells a story in itself. I hope the music is appropriate. A little lower, okay. Okay, there we go. Is that all right, Jim? Okay. We won't spend any time talking about the Civil War. Enough books and movies and serials have been done on the Civil War. We know the devastation that it caused throughout the South, and especially here in Alabama and right here in the Auburn area. As president of the Historical Society, we're always talking about Wilson's Raiders out at the end of the Civil War, coming through Notasulga, Lochapoka, Auburn, destroying the railroad track and everything in its path. So after the Civil War, the South was destitute. It was like a lot of countries that are defeated in devastating wars. When these veterans came back from the war, many of them were wounded. Their farms, their plantations had been destroyed. Their livelihood had been destroyed. They had no wealth. It was gone. In many cases, we've heard about the carpetbaggers that followed and how they took advantage of this situation. But there was one thing that the veterans, the widows, and the emancipated slaves knew how to do. That was grow cotton. That's all they knew how to do. That's all they had done for the last 50 years was grow cotton. So when they came back, there was a big demand for cotton. Europe was still there, still had their textile mills in England and France. New England had built its textile industry up, and there were a few textile mills starting to be built in the South. Tallahassee is a good example of one of those mills that was pre-Civil War, actually. It started. And after the Civil War, a lot of this textile industry moved south to take advantage of this cheap cotton that was being grown, and this cotton production rapidly increased after the Civil War quickly to the same level that it was before the Civil War. As you can see on this slide here, this is about 1900. This is 1860, picking up where we left off last time. Cotton production actually peaked in Alabama about 1911 and 1912. And we'll come back to this slide in a few minutes and show you what happened in 1911 and 1912 that caused that big drop. Yields didn't change very much. See the cotton yields there? That's about 100 pounds of lint. That's not much. And it stayed about there. It may be a little bit of increase up until this 1911 event that I'll point out later. But cotton yields did not change very much. The land was literally worn out. There were no fertilizers. There were no conservation practices. They didn't know about contour plowing, building terraces. They didn't know about that. They had no concept of fertilizers. They knew that manures helped crops produce better, but they didn't understand the essentiality of certain plant nutrients. And of course, there was a limited supply of manures to be used. Cotton production rapidly increased. And in fact, I saw this picture in about a 1910 publication by Professor J.F. Duggar. Dr. Duggar is the one that started the old rotation, and he wrote two very important early textbooks on agriculture in the southeastern United States. I was just shocked when I saw that picture there, showing the wrong way to store cotton in winter. Does somebody have to tell these farmers they can't leave the cotton bales out in the rain in the wintertime? But that's illustrated. They didn't have a place to put it. They were producing so much cotton, there were no warehouses, barns to put this cotton. So Professor Duggar was telling them, don't leave your cotton out in the wintertime. I don't understand why they had to tell them that, but he did. All this cotton production before the Civil War and then that rapid increase after the war was devastating for much of Alabama. Books have been written that have told us that a foot of topsoil off the entire Piedmont is gone. It's washed away. The next few slides that were taken in Lee, Chambers, Tallapoosa County in this area right here. It was probably worse here in the Piedmont than in any other parts of the state, but it was bad everywhere else. Tennessee Valley had erosion, but it wasn't as devastating in the Tennessee Valley because their soils are deeper. They didn't have these little shallow topsoils on top of a clayey subsoil like we do in the Piedmont. But you cannot find a field in the Piedmont where the original topsoil is there anymore. In fact, when the Louise Kreshner Forest was established several years ago, we were out there trying to find an original topsoil in that forest. It's gone. That whole forest, up until the 1950s, was cleared, and cotton was grown on it. That's hard to believe. Now it's pine trees. But eventually we found a site, and it was there, you know, where the Friendship Cemetery is, that butts up the Friendship Baptist Church on North College Street. Right across there is the Louise Kreshner Forest, and there's a little cemetery there. And on that cemetery, we found an original topsoil. And that's because the cemetery wasn't farmed. It didn't wash away. So it's amazing. But these pictures really are shocking to me, that we could allow our land to become this totally devastated. If you've ever been to the park over in Canyons, what's it called? In Providence Canyon State Park over in Georgia, you've seen an extreme example of what I'm talking about here. I was doing a cotton survey in the 1990s over in Elmore County, just adjacent to us here, and I walked to the edge of a cotton field, and that's what I saw. And in fact, the rows of the cotton ended where this canyon began. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but that's a gravel road that I came in on. And this gravel road actually made a big bend and circled around this canyon. And of course, the cotton field was behind me when I took this picture. We have the same thing in Alabama. It's just not as extensive as it was over in southwest Georgia, where Providence Canyon is today. But this is the same soil formation, that Providence formation, and the same type situation that occurred over there. That land was farmed. It was all cut. That is a direct result of poor land management. By the late 19th century, most farms were in a depression with low yields, worn out land, and little hope. And the amazing thing is that when cotton prices were low and the farmers were destitute, what did they do? Planted more cotton. Yeah, exactly.
It's just like the Dust Bowl, it's just a different...
It's a difference is exactly that this occurred before the Dust Bowl. It looks like we would have learned a lesson, but we didn't. When I saw this picture, I got to thinking, there's a wagon there pulled by 2 mules with about 5 bales of cotton on it. Each of those bales weighs about 500 pounds. We've talked about that before, 480 to 500 pounds. So in 1883, the average yield of lint per acre was about 100 pounds per acre. You saw that graph that I showed you. So we'll just say about 100 pounds of lint per acre. That's about a seed cotton is what we call the cotton that we pick in the field that has the seed in it. Seed cotton is about 36 to 40% lint, somewhere in that. So it would take about 400 pounds of seed cotton that you would have to pick to make 100 pounds of cotton. So this family, in order to produce this 5 bales of cotton, would have to harvest about 25 acres. 25 acres, and let's assume that's a family there that's doing that. Both of the mules would be needed to work this land. The family would also need to raise about 25 acres of corn. Corn yields in 5, 10 bushels per acre, not much, but it would take that many acres to produce the grain, to feed the mules, to feed their dairy cow, to feed any livestock, the chickens, the pigs on the farm. So about 25 acres of corn, in addition to the 25 acres of cotton. So you've always heard about 40 acres in a mule. Somebody that's what it would take for a family to survive, about 40 acres in a mule. And you could survive if you could grow that much cotton and corn. A family of 5 would have to work from sun up until sundown for 25 to 30 days just to pick this much cotton. I did the calculations, assume the mom and a dad and 3 kids, 25, all 3 of them working sun up to sundown for 25 to 30 days. And so you think about harvest starting in the end of August, and of course you have some rainy days, you have some bad days, some days it's too wet to get in the field. So from end of August to early mid-November, maybe even later, they're out there picking cotton every chance they get. The kids didn't have a chance to go to school. And I tell school groups that come out in the fall to Pioneer Park, I said, look, folks, you wouldn't be in school today if you were around 100 years ago. You'd be working in the cotton fields. Yes, had a couple of questions in the back.
My wife grew up in Alabama, north of Birmingham, and there they had, I think, a month off from school in the fall to pick cotton.
They did that, yeah. Jim, you had... Oh, okay. Oh. So that's not the end of the story. In 1883, cotton was bringing 2.7 cents per pound. This is one of the low. This is one of the low years. By 1910, it was up to about 10 cents a pound. Anybody have a guess what it is today? It's about 70 cents a pound. I haven't checked lately, but it's somewhere around 70 cents a pound. That's pretty bad, really. It's only increased 7-fold since 1910. Price of everything else has increased many times more than that. So it's interesting to our farmers today that in real dollars, they're getting less today than they did back in 1910. But still, 2.7 cents per pound. So they paid the gin for ginning the cotton by giving them the seed. The seed had value. They could make cottonseed meal out of it. So the gin usually kept the seed as payment for ginning the cotton. So therefore, if you take 2.7 cents per pound times 2,500 pounds of lint of those 5 bales, the family brought home $67.50. This is all the cash they had to survive on until next year. But remember, this is Reconstruction, post-Civil War. There were no slaves anymore. The sharecropping system had replaced slavery. So half of that went to pay the landlord as the tenant's share of growing the crop. And this didn't matter whether you were a white tenant farmer or a black tenant farmer. It was all the same. So you can see what kind of situation Alabama was in, because everybody in the state in 1883 or so, everybody lived on a farm. Every one of you grew cotton in 1883. Birmingham was just starting to find industrial steel industry developing up there. It was just getting started. There was no industry. A few textile mills around the state, and they employed mostly women and children. So it was a pretty desperate situation. And you can see it in some of these pictures were probably made in the early 1900s. I don't have an exact date, but I expect this is pretty typical. Yeah. So we didn't have a choice. You know, you stayed here and suffered, or you did something else, or you left. And I expect that song, "Oh Susanna," was probably written about this era as people were immigrating westward, the great migration west, moving out of these worn-out lands in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, moving west. In this case, he was going to Louisiana, his true love for to see. But that was the situation. And of course, we know just not too many years after this, less than 50 years after this, they had worn out the land in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and they went on to California, and now they're all coming back. So, it was this period that the concept of the land-grant institution was started. 1862, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which created something unique in the United States, something unique in the world, a system of state-supported agricultural and mechanical colleges for the common man, for the farmer out there who needed to know engineering skills and to learn something about scientific agriculture. A new concept, a crazy idea. You didn't learn agriculture from a book at that time. You learned it from your daddy. You learned it from your granddaddy. Going to school to learn agriculture? Crazy. In fact, there were no books about agriculture. A few private journals had been kept by some wise citizens in the Carolinas. Professor Duggar's books in 1910 were some of the earliest written about how do you farm? How do you raise things, how do you raise crops sustainably? They didn't use the word sustainably, but basically that's what it was. I didn't know that was going to start over again, but Alabama was one of the first states to adopt this Morrill Act in the southern, of the former Confederate states. Alabama was one of the first to adopt it in 1872. And basically what happened, the federal government gave the states property, land, federal lands that they could do with whatever they wanted to. And I'm told that the president of Auburn, the president of the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Alabama at that time, sold the property for railroad bonds. Thought it was a good investment. It wasn't. The railroads went kaput. And Auburn lost most of its land grant at that time. So it had to rebuild from nothing, basically. But there's another story I like to tell, and this is not one you hear much about how Auburn became the site of the land grant institution. And you may have heard another version of this. This is the one I like the best. Since I grew up in West Alabama, and both of my great uncles graduated from what was then Southern University in Greensboro, I can have a little connection to both schools. After the Civil War, the Methodist College had two institutions, Southern University in Greensboro and East Alabama Male College in Auburn. And they told the state of Alabama, you can have either one of these. We can't keep them up. We can't afford to keep up these. Oh, actually, they had more colleges than that. But that was two of them that they were willing to give to the state of Alabama for whatever use the state had for them. There were other schools in competition as well. University of Alabama, what is now University of North Alabama in Florence, was in heavy contention for the land grant, for the site of the land grant institution. But the state of Alabama, in its wisdom, I think, picked Auburn over Greensboro, which made absolutely no sense in 1872. In 1872, all the political power was in the Black Belt region of Alabama, West Alabama, around Greensboro. Greensboro, Demopolis, Marion, Selma, Montgomery. That was where all the political power was. So why would they pick this little remote town over in East Alabama that was nothing here but one building that they called the East Alabama Male College? I think it was because Auburn had a railroad. Greensboro to this day has no railroad. You could not get there in the wintertime. And since everyone traveled by train, you know, they had to get students from all over the state to this college, and they couldn't get to Greensboro. So I think that, more than any other reason, is why Auburn became the site of the land-grant institution called the Agricultural Mechanical College of Alabama. And we credit our founding to 1856, which is also the founding of Southern University in Greensboro, which no longer exists today. Around 1900, Southern University merged with a little college in Birmingham called Birmingham College, and today is Birmingham Southern College, which happens to be my alma mater. So give you a little bit of extra history there that you probably didn't know. And they claim 1856 as their founding date as well. It amazes me how progressive Alabama was during this era. In spite of the devastation from the Civil War, our leaders, they had some foresight. We were the first state to create an agricultural experiment station system. You know, in 1872, we suddenly had this college over here that could teach agriculture, but there was no books about agriculture. There was no scientific basis for what they had to teach. So to create that scientific basis, the Alabama legislature created the Alabama Agricultural Experiment Station in 1883 to conduct research. So now we had the teaching and we had the research part. And in 1911, eventually came along the extension part when the Cooperative Extension Service was founded to take this information and take it out to the citizens of the state. So that's why our tripartite mission today at Auburn University is teaching, research, and extension. You see that on the Auburn University logo. Of course, now the most popular word for extension is outreach, but we're talking about the same thing, that getting it out to the public. And that is the three-part mission of Auburn University as a land-grant institution. We visited the old rotation 2 weeks ago, and I mentioned then that J.F. Duggar, John Franklin Duggar, made this quote in one of his books, which I have not been able to find that book, but I wrote it down the day I read it. And he said, Alabama agriculture will come into its own when her fields are green in winter. And we visited the old rotation, which was established in 1896. Now, there were other experiments. This was not the first experiment. There were lots of other experiments conducted in and around Auburn before then, but that's the only one that has managed to survive to today, and it happens to be the experiment where he tested his theories about keeping the fields green in winter. Planting a cover crop, not plowing the land and allowing it to wash away during the winter rains. And of course, shortly after this, fertilizers came onto the scene, and of course we started to use fertilizers. Today, crimson clover is one of 2 winter cover crops that we've used on the old rotation. Today we're growing mostly vetch, but vetch and crimson clover are both very productive winter cover crops that are grown strictly as what we call a green manure to add organic matter to the soil. And you can see the results. This was taken from a cherry picker in 1996. That was before the days we had the little drones. You know, couldn't do it with a drone, but that was taken for the centennial celebration of the old rotation. And you can see those different treatments there. That's continuous cotton. That's cotton with a winter legume. Only difference. Same everything, except that one has a winter legume planted. Same fertilizer, everything. And we saw Bill go out and try to stick a tube, a soil sampling tube, and actually it was this plot right here that he was trying to sample, and he could not get the tube in the ground. But he went over to the adjacent plot, and he could go down 12 to 18 inches. And all that's due to the difference in managing and improvement in soil quality through the planting of winter legumes. So Professor Duggar, within the first few years after he introduced the old rotation, he had proved a point. And this point was written by Frank Davis in 1949 Cotton as a crop does not deplete the soil or run it down excessively. The cultural practices of leaving the land bare through the winter and of not preventing erosion are responsible for the generally low fertility level of many soils on which cotton is grown. Gosh, time gets by fast. You want to take a quick break, a quick 5-minute break? Stand up, stretch your legs. Dr. Rod talked a little bit about velvet beans, introduced probably in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a terrific nitrogen fixer, and he pointed out the fact that they were resistant to root knot nematodes. They were grown extensively in the early part of the 20th century. There's just been a renewed interest in velvet beans. It's not necessarily a cash crop, but it is a good nitrogen fixer and a companion crop for crops such as corn. This is Crotalaria, introduced by the Soil Conservation Corps in the 1930s. I mentioned Crotalaria in one of the earlier classes. It's a great summer legume. There aren't many summer legumes. We have a lot of winter legumes, things like crimson clover and vetch, and most of your clovers are winter legumes, but there are not a lot of summer legumes. And this is one that was introduced. It did a great job of holding the earth together, preventing soil erosion, and fixing nitrogen. The only problem is it's very toxic to livestock. So you certainly don't want to turn your cows in on a field. And now it's illegal to bring Crotalaria seed into Alabama. Okay, yeah. I think it's something wrong with my sound, because I won't make sure the sound is working. It's not working. Yeah, there it is. If you want to know more about this bug, see Rod's publication out there in the hall, and he'll answer some questions next week. We may have some time today for you to answer some questions about this creature. It entered Alabama from Mexico in 1892, and by 1922 it covered the entire cotton belt, a sea of cotton. The thing about the boll weevil, it won't eat anything but cotton. It likes those little immature squares we call, before it actually becomes a boll. It's what that boll weevil preys on, and it lays its eggs in that square. The square falls on the ground, and a new generation results. And as long as there's cotton around, it can reproduce, and it had no trouble in finding a home. I was looking for that song, looking for a home, about the boll weevil. I could not find it on the internet, but I'm going to keep looking. But I thought Wabash Cannonball was a pretty good example of how fast it covered the South. From this point on, all efforts at Auburn, in 1900 it became the Alabama Polytechnic Institute. So from this point on, all the efforts at the Alabama Polytechnic Institute focused on killing this bug. And Dr. Rod just told me a few minutes ago that in 1908, in anticipation, I suppose, of this creature coming here, they knew it was on the way, just a matter of time before it got here, that they hired one of the best cotton entomologists in the world to come to Auburn. Who was that?
Professor Hines from Texas A&M. It would have been the equivalent of hiring Coach Saban from University of Alabama to come to Auburn.
Oh, okay. All right, that sounds like a pretty good coup. And this, you saw this slide earlier. This is where we were in 1910, 1911, and this is what happened. Cotton acreage plummeted. Yields, that was a pretty dramatic, that's a 50% drop in yields right there. If you think about it, that doesn't look too dramatic on this whole slide, but it was very dramatic drop in yields. But more importantly, the cotton production, just the acreage of cotton plummeted because there was no way at all at controlling this insect. Later it increased a little bit during the 1920s and 30s, but then acreage plummeted again and it hasn't stopped dropping since. All the efforts from this point forward were, how do we kill the boll weevil? That's when the term cotton poison became just a household word around the farms in Alabama. Everybody had some cotton poison. And they didn't know what it was, but as long as it killed the boll weevil, who cared? It could kill you, but they didn't. They wanted to kill that boll weevil. That was the most important thing because that was their livelihood. The more toxic compound, the better. And this, again, came out of Professor Duggar's book. Says the poison being applied as fine dust by team-drawn machine, calcium arsenate. I'm also told they use lead arsenate, Rod, which is extremely poisonous to almost any living creature. This little guy, he's no longer alive. I don't think it was the cotton poison that killed him, but nevertheless, there was no EPA. There was no regulations. If it killed the boll weevil, they used it. Over in the Museum of East Alabama, if you haven't been there, they have a boll weevil trap. I think it's an amazing little, I borrowed it one time for an exhibit that we had, but it's this machine that you run between, on either side of the row, and has these fingers that beat the cotton and a basket underneath it that catches the boll weevils in it. So when you get to the end of the row, you simply dump out that basket and stomp on the boll weevils, and that was considered a desperate way of controlling. Of course, it didn't work. It didn't work over the long haul. It probably gave the farmer a lot of satisfaction, but I don't know what chemical they're applying there, but at least they have on handkerchiefs over their nose to protect themselves. So. One professor here at Auburn said, okay, folks, it's time to give up cotton. We've tried it for 100+ years now. We need to move on. North Carolina actually, and Virginia actually adopted this idea of switching from cotton to tobacco. And it worked, because the further north you get, the less productive cotton becomes. The colder the weather, it doesn't grow as well, so tobacco probably was a better crop for the Carolinas. But these farmers in Alabama, they had always grown cotton. Their daddy had grown cotton, their granddaddies had grown cotton, their great-granddaddies had grown cotton, you know, and so darn it, they're going to keep on growing cotton as long as they possibly can. And we have grown tobacco. We can grow tobacco just fine in Alabama. I plant some every year out at Pioneer Park just to show kids what it looks like. Even though there is no longer any commercial production in Alabama, but there used to be sizable tobacco production down in Butler County, around Greenville, and up in around the Huntsville area. There was some dark fire tobacco grown up there, right on the Tennessee line, just north of Huntsville. But I don't think there's any commercial tobacco being grown in Alabama anymore.
Peanuts, peanuts. Love you and I'll never let you go. Peanuts, 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 peanuts. Yes, you're my girl. Love you and I'll never let you go.
About you, baby, won't you call my name?
Peanuts, 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 peanuts. love you and I'll never let you go. Peanuts, 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 peanuts.
Well, I love you, peanuts, oh my heart and soul. You know I'm crazy about you, babe.
Crazy about you, baby, won't you call my name?
Peanuts,
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 peanuts.
peanuts.
Yes, you're my girl.
Love you and I'll never let you go. Love you and I'll never let you go. Peanuts, 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 peanuts.
I think those slides are pretty self-explanatory. Dr. Carver was working on peanuts before the boll weevil arrived, but it just so happened that it turned out to be a darn good crop. It is a summer legume. You don't have to put any nitrogen fertilizer on it. It loved these eroded, worn out, sandy soils from here south. It grows best in those soils. And that's where it took off. And that's why the city of Enterprise has the only monument to an insect pest in the world, as far as I know. Yes, Rod?
Charlie, we did a video this summer, about 3 minutes, with the Alabama.com folks in Birmingham, and it's under This Is Alabama, and it's a story about why the statue was built, so you can still Google and bring that up.
Oh, really? Okay.
About a week later, the Wall Street Journal picked up on it, and on the front page on September the 9th, there was a story about the city of Enterprise and the role that the boll weevil and the peanuts led to the prosperity of that area.
It's an amazing story, and I was looking for a song about peanuts, and I couldn't find one. I didn't. Yeah, picking goober. I was looking for that song too, and I couldn't find it. And one of the ladies at work, where I worked, she remembered this, that Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, you know, the Jersey Boys did. I don't know if you recognize that. I don't remember it. Yeah, but I thought it was it just worked perfectly for this segment there, peanuts. So that's the story of how peanuts really became an important crop in Alabama. Today it's at some times, in some years, the peanut crop is worth more than the cotton crop in Alabama. But they kind of run neck and neck. Generally, we say peanuts are second behind cotton as far as total crop value. That may not be the case every year. But the peanut production has spread from the wiregrass area, the Dothan, the Eufaula, to Andalusia area down there, to the rest of the state. So now we're growing peanuts from the Tennessee line all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, to some extent commercial peanut production. Because as Dr. Rod pointed out, it is a great rotation crop with cotton. It's more responsive to rotating than cotton is. So you have to rotate peanuts. And that was one of the problems that they got into in the wiregrass, where they were trying to, back when we had the U.S. government programs that forced farmers to grow peanuts every year. That became a real problem. Now they're encouraged to rotate. Okay, that finishes the second part. Rod, you wanted to, we actually have about more than 30 minutes. So we could start the third. Okay. Rod had a few other things that he wanted to add. Next week, we'll pick up with part 3 and start with what happened during the rest of the 20th century to Alabama cotton production and to agriculture in general of the state. And we'll finish up talking about modern agriculture in Alabama and how it contrasts with the old ways of doing things. Dr. Rod wanted to cover a few things with you. You need. Okay. Here.
She's coming.
Do you want your presentation? Do you want part 5 of your presentation, or are you just going to talk? Okay, hold on a second. I like the sweatshirt. It's nice. All right, there you go.
Okay. You got, yeah, there it is. Wasn't that great? It's really good. Okay. I thought we can go through this fairly fast. Are you hearing me? Okay. All right. And we'll get into what we call part 5, and that is moving westward. And they will repeat some of what Charlie's already presented. So we will look at upland cotton characteristics. Okay. Eli Whitney, of course. Transportation economics, and a little bit more on the slave labor. Okay. I like to emphasize, and I keep repeating it, that cotton was instrumental, really. Already I presented you earlier on the dye industry, okay, the coloring industry. Then food industry, not only cotton itself, cotton seed oil, but also bringing peanuts into the equation, okay. Mechanics, lots of inventiveness and so on to make it more efficient to produce fiber from cotton. And then, of course, the new cropping system and production systems. All right. The upland cotton that's got sitting here, so already Charlie mentioned that in the early part of the cotton production, what they had were 2 types of cottons. One was the Sea Island or long staple cotton, which was not very appropriate for inland. And inland they had 2 cottons. One was black seeded and another green seeded. That they were shorter staple. They were okay, but not completely easy to work with. Particularly in the matter of separating the fiber. When it was done by hand, 2 pounds of fiber per day per person, okay? Not an encouraging proposition at that time for taking advantage of this price, this new crop price. But yeah, it looks good, but look, we got this bottleneck, all right. In 1806, okay, this is very important to understand. The whole equation changed. Some Walter Burning brought from Natchez, brought cotton seed from Mexico, which had larger bolls, okay, and were much easier to, to pick. All right. So that was very, very important. And what is important that since then, and from that introduction, all the breeding work and anything that we have done in the United States and the rest of the world relate to that germplasm. They relate to that introduction. And of course entered, Charlie already lucidly presented this. I just say, wow. I mean, this, talking about a changing the game, this man did it. And in Lochapoca, they have a beautiful museum on historical agricultural machinery and so on, and you will see they have examples of the cotton gin, okay? Here is first page of the patent that was granted to Eli Whitney. I found it in the web, and I'm not going to go into detail because Charlie already has covered this. That was one, and this is a larger one, and this is a period picture of the operation of processing the cotton seed. And already we went through this. The cotton with seeds goes through the cat thing, the cylinder, the brushes separating, you got clean cotton here. It is further processed, okay? You further process it, and essentially becomes a cleaning up thing, okay? And here's a mother. The gin is down here, cotton gin is here. All of these is a process of cleaning and carefully measuring the moisture in the fiber. And it leads to here, the lint cleaners, and then finally they're able to press the cotton and make the bale. So that is pretty much not really complicated, but it's pretty much depicts the process. Of course, this is one of the great guys, and please do not make the mistake of thinking that the gin was the only thing this man invented. He was really a mechanical genius. He never made a cent out of the gin that he invented because it was too simple to make. But he made a lot of money, and this is why I put this on the background, in working with other mechanical things and other inventions that he had, okay? The cotton created new industries that are already, and this is one. The Whitney cotton gin was simple to make. Soon everybody had one and had to have one. Could be enlarged to provide for greater capacity and the use of water or steam power. That was very important here. Increased productivity by a factor of 50. So think about that. I mean, this was really revolutionary. So you had the cotton here, you had the problem of separating, this opened up that problem. So made it possible to really go big on it. The most importantly, this is a very, very important point, enable use of short staple and upland cotton, which before was difficult to separate from fiber. No need for long staple island cottons, which we couldn't grow inland anyway, okay? In fact, you could almost use any kind of cotton. So this opened the possibilities. Now, you didn't have to be, hog-tied to particular variety or particular, no, this will free you from that. So this is a magnificent thing. The economics, transportation costs from production site to export harbors inland, okay, were favorable. Distance from, Charlie already pointed this out, distance from harbors to English textile operation. This is important because the English were the only ones that were really requiring large quantities of cotton for their own inventions across the pond. The South had the Mississippi, Red River, Tombigbee, and so forth, and low cost of transportation. And we can see this in the map, and I'm not going to delve with Charlie already covered the significance of this. All I have to say is so important that it is in our coat of arms. There it is. So I don't think any other state has anything like this. So that is really was critical for the economy, the development of the economy of the state. Steam power came. That's the original thing, watts, okay? And with time, this was combined with the river transportation. And these are additional pictures to what Charlie showed. Here it is, okay.
How high would that well have been, or
I'm sorry?
before it was loaded?
I'm not understanding. Charlie?
I'm just asking how much the draft would have been before it was loaded.
Yeah.
Today, those barges have to be less than 9 feet draft. So the barges in the Annabelle, Alabama, could not travel up the rivers in summertime. They only would during the winter. The rivers had a rise.
Right.
And that created problems too. Well, the logs and everything else coming out of it. But I'm told, any of you familiar with the Cahaba River that goes through Central? I'm told that there were a few occasions when riverboats went up the Cahaba River, all the way to Central. That's pretty amazing. That's a very shallow river.
But this you see here in contrast, you know, they're steam powered. These guys are still going the hard way. But they could reach almost anywhere. Right there, okay. By 1866, this is a map in 1866 of the railroad and river and all communications in Alabama, and you see it was very, very well developed. I know the war accelerated this, but it is essentially shows a tremendous development. If you start out from 1800 to 1866, Alabama you really could almost reach anywhere, either through railroad or through river. This is to show you the importance of steam. And this is the arrivals of steamboats in New Orleans from 1813 to 1859. You see how quickly, and cotton, of course, was preeminent in supporting this development. The distance from Mobile, Savannah, and so forth, Charleston, to Liverpool, Manchester, the heart of the English textile industry, was much shorter than anywhere else. The English could get it from Turkey, and you had to go this way and up this way, or you can go down to Pernambuco in Brazil and go up here, and you can see the distance. And there were all the complications. The Turkish-Egyptian cotton, recall that Egypt was under the Ottoman rule then. There were a lot of protocol and bureaucracies that you had to go through, so it was complicated, okay? So, to us, it boiled down the safest, the best, most reliable way to get large quantities of cotton into England was from the south. That was clear. Already, we see the increase in the population of white slaves. The free population of slaves almost didn't register in the previous slide. Cotton, from 1850, when found 500,000, to 1860, then dropped at the war, and then quickly picked up. Okay. And that is in the antebellum days. this shows clearly, I think, the number of whites and the slaves were 1-to-1. And, okay. The relation between the pounds of cotton, okay, produced related to the number of slaves. It went up, excuse me, it went up sort of this way. With time, it dropped, okay? It became, you would say, less and less efficient. No, it was that the slaves were used for something else, okay? Not just cotton. It's other industries and things required slave labor, so this is why you see the drop. Cotton production in the United States as related to imports, Great Britain, imports of cotton. And you can see they go very closely. So the English were very, very dependent on the southern cotton. And there's another way. This is cotton production in the United States. And British imports. But this is total imports of cotton, not just from the United States, because they did import from Egypt quite a bit, and then later on a little bit from India. So if you bring it down to the import from the United States, it kind of peaked, see? And it peaked because the English always had in mind that at some point, the cotton production from the South, you know, as pleasing as they were with it, would be derived to other manufacturing, by then other manufacturing places in Europe and then in the United States, which is exactly what happened. So they were, yes, we're very happy with it, but you're not the only one. And they kept that open. I summarized. Serious problem with processing a short staple. That was solved with the ginning. Keep in mind the time, how quickly this whole thing happened. It's almost incredible. Cotton production and slave population grew exponentially, 1800. Transportation costs were very low and of definite advantage over cotton produced abroad. See, they could have produced it, but could they deliver it to a port that would be very close to the Liverpool, Manchester area? That was key. Extensive availability of river transport and early adoption of steamboats. That was the key. And that's it. Okay.